Hello and welcome to another edition of Business to Business, the Tigers regular podcast, give you an insight into the businesses that are involved with the club itself, find out a little bit more about those businesses and ultimately the individuals who are driving them forward. And we're lucky enough today to be joined by the CEO of one of our longest serving partners here at Leicester Tigers, that is Global Payments. And Pete Bettles, thank you for giving up your time on such a busy day to come and talk to us.
Pleasure, Mark. Nice to speak to you.
Kind of rough format around it, and ultimately, you know, it ebbs and flows as such, really. But a really good starting point for a lot of these podcasts is actually almost talking about your journey. So, if you're happy to kind of bring us up to speed, where did your professional career start, and kind of talk us through the building blocks that have brought you to where you're at today as a big leader of a big global brand, obviously based relatively local to Leicester still.
Yeah, sure. And I guess what I would say first of all is, the way my career has progressed and my entry point, I guess, is never going to happen again because of the way in which certainly the UK employment market has changed. But also, I think about my own children. It's kind of not necessarily how I'd encourage them to do it, but you will see as we talk. It's probably what governs a lot of the way in which I think about things. But I mean, I left school at 16. Which actually I say is the best decision I ever made, because my mindset was not right to carry on academic work. And not everybody's academic, right? And I think, we've obviously started to understand that with things like modern apprenticeships and things like that, but that didn't exist back in the day. And I left school really wanting to be an engineer, just wanted to do something practical. And that was really where, I guess, if I had skills, that's where they were. But I also had the opportunity to join Midland Bank back then. And I joined in 1985 Midland Bank on what was in those days called YTS, which I guess was similar to modern apprenticeships, but it was
what would Midland Bank today?
Midland Bank a number of years later became HSBC.
It's HSBC. Yeah.
So yeah, 37 years ago I started. Well, 38 years here. I started work at Midland Bank, which then became HSBC. And then, and I did a number of roles in retail banking, all the things that you would have expected and seen. And then I ended up in corporate banking, which is sort of lending and relationship management, which is, again, has driven a lot of the way in which I think about things. And then I joined what back in those days was HSBC Merchant Services, the payments business. And 15 years ago, almost to the day, actually, we went out looking for somebody who would run our acquiring business for us, because HSBC wasn't well suited to that side of the business. No criticism, it's just wasn't their forte in mainstream banking. And I was part of a team that found Global Payments, an American-based organization, which is where we are today. And we transitioned fairly quickly from a joint venture with Midland Bank into a wholly owned subsidiary. So, done a whole variety of things, but I started all the way back as a YTS. I put a lot of effort and worked hard, which I guess
didn't have to clean the showers and brush other people's shoes in your industry, I'd imagine, no?
Well, in reality, I spent the first 6 months of my career following an electrician around a bank who was rewiring the branch. That was kind of, was it a good introduction to work? I guess in some respects, yes, but in most, no. But what I did do is I then went on and did a degree while I was working, and did a degree in financial services, which was really interesting. It hasn't formed the way in which I do things or how I work, but it was interesting from a personal development point of view and how I maybe organise myself personally.
But you touched on there is that movement from would be HSBC Merchant Services into Global Payments as such. Are you happy to just share what that process looks like from a state, for those that have never been involved or interested in that side of what it's like to merge, sell, and all those other bits, the components that make up that transition?
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole spectrum of emotions, in honesty. And, I was on the right side, if you like, in that I knew about this all coming in. And we're in the middle of another massive integration of a whole set of businesses for us across Europe at the moment. So I always draw upon how people feel about that as we're going through these sorts of changes, and the way in which all businesses change, either organically or through acquisition mergers, is a really important thing. And I think I mean, there's a number of different elements, and we could talk for way too long. But let me just focus in on people, right? Because I think that's the most important thing when you think about these things. And I say the emotions for somebody like, if I wasn't on the inside, the way I felt after working for the bank for nearly 25 years, and that sort of safety net of a massive organization which I'd grown up inside and I knew and I loved, into this American organization, right? And all the things that go with that. People think, how Americans operate and all these things, which is generally not true, by the way. But there's a whole lot of fear and trepidation. For me personally, because I was on the right side of that conversation, I knew coming in, and I'd met some of the leadership team, and in the way in which we'd organised the deal, I actually looked at it as quite a lot of excitement. I mean, I'm a naturally fairly conservative guy, I would say. I mean, from a career point of view, like I say, I've done 37 years in effect in the same organisation, even though it's changed around me. So that probably tells you a little bit about how brave am I about managing my own career. I've had a lot of opportunity and a lot of challenges, which has fueled my comfort from staying in the same organisation. But in the change, what I did is I saw an opportunity in a fairly safe way to make a fairly big leap from a company I'd known for 25 years into a new company. So, like I say, different people, different emotions. There is naturally quite a lot of uncertainty. People worry about the future of their jobs, which is a very natural human reaction to change. And I think the need to sort of think very carefully and deliberately about that, increase your communication a lot more, right? Talk to them about it as a group, what's going on, right? Because I can't see everything that's going on, through to individually, one-to-one, how are you feeling about it? Can you see the opportunities that are in front of you? Try and physically distill some of those fears. So there's a lot in it. It's a long process. It's very complicated as you think about the customers, everything from facilities through to products to the contracts, and there's a wealth of things going on inside there with a very complicated multi-stream plan. But I think if you think about the people, and then and I mean your own people, and then you think about the customers and how you take them on the journey, everything else will kind of work out.
Yeah, and it's quite relevant, because a lot of businesses will have gone through probably an internal, a very similar internal process in the last 3 years, to understand that it's not easy. Like you say, people are a very strong consideration in that, rightly so as such. But actually, the physical process of it isn't quick either. So you kind of, and I'm guessing, when you go through that process, it's certainly months, if not years, rather than the short thing that ultimately, ideally, probably everyone would like to be on both sides, wouldn't you? Really, you'd hate to be living it for longer than you need to.
I think that's absolutely. I think, like I say, this is just one example of change, and actually, the natural characteristics of change are fairly consistent in all things. The difference in some of these sort of large integration type efforts, to your point, is the timeline often, and therefore the uncertainty lasts for longer, and they often are preceded by a lot of behind the curtain, very secretive conversations, because they're market sensitive. Yeah. So if I take that particular deal or the one that we're working on now, there was 9 months of secrecy, right, where nobody knew why I was disappearing for weeks to why was I in these countries that we weren't operating in today? And people start filling in the blanks, and they're often right by the time they get to it, but it's not appropriate to talk at that point. So again, all those things you just have to think about. But again, it's an interesting topic to pull out, Mark. But I think anybody who thinks about it should think about it exactly the same for all change, and that whether that's how am I going to adapt to COVID, to how am I adapting to coming out of COVID, to how am I transitioning from a challenging economic position right now, all very much the same. And I think think about your customers, think about your people, think about increasing your communication. And like I say, if you get all those things right, typically I think everything else will fall into line.
Yeah, good point. And again, I suppose fast forwarding through to today, and you look at global payments as a business and try summarize it as culture. What is it like? how does that exist within global payment, and what does it look like, as you sit here in 2023, in the summer of 2023?
Yeah, so I mean, the business itself is increased significantly as a global business. One of our aspirations was Fortune 500, and we achieved that a few years ago, and that was before this most recent acquisition. So we accelerate through that. We're not focused as much on that, but that really gives you access to a number of different things, which really helps the way in which you grow the business. But global payments now, I'll not talk about the sort of metrics of it for any great detail, but we're in 170 countries, 41 physically, and I'm still waiting for my assignment to the Maldives, where we've got some people based out there. But so we're all over the globe. 27,000 employees, 4.6 million customers, and processing over 70 billion transactions a year. So its significance is now massive from a culture point of view. And the other thing I'd say is we also have now, through another acquisition, an issuing side of our business. And I won't get geeky about payments because most people just want it to work, but the card side of it versus the acceptance side of it. And I'm on the acceptance side of payments, but we have both. When you think about those two sort of complementary industries, and then you think about all the different countries, to try and establish a culture across the group is frankly mission impossible, and you probably break things by trying to do it. So there's lots of idiosyncrasies, but I think there are some things that I would say, and we can call them values or culture, but the things that we look for and are important. And number one is back to people. People are important. That's what makes the difference. The people that are interacting with customers, if you find the right people who are attributing the right behaviors, then again, I think you're in a really solid place. Some of those behaviors, so some of those things, I think you also need to look for diverse perspectives. And diversity, of course, is an important characteristic everywhere. But I'm not necessarily talking about sex, race, creed, religion, any of those things that we talk a lot about, and rightly so. But it's the experiences people have been through. If you can find people with diverse experiences, that all helps. And I've spent, in my time here, particularly since I was in corporate banking, the thing I lean in on a lot is, because I spent a lot of time with customers really trying to understand what happens inside their business, what their pain points are. That's a real asset. If I can find people who can put themselves in a customer's shoes and say, when I do these things, when I'm talking to them about something, I understand why I'm not the most important call that they're going to have today. They're a restaurant. They're thinking about how many covers they're going to get, how they're going to get customers coming back all time and time again, the quality of the materials they get. I am not the most important call. And I think if we can get people to see it in that sort of perspective, rather than automatically thinking, what's important to them is important to the customer, that helps. Trust is a massively important thing. Developing trust with customers, of course, but trust with each other, and again, I do think a natural human instinct is people are either naturally slightly cynical of each other until they know them, or they trust. And again, we spend a lot of time trying to instill a principle of, first of all, trust people. Until you shouldn't trust them, you should trust them, because people generally set out with the right intent. Sometimes they're clumsy. Sometimes they are put in a position where to deliver other things, they may challenge the priorities of others. But you have to trust the intent behind people, because that's what carves out the relationships that are so important. The other two things I would call out is innovative thinking. We want people who will challenge things every day, and no criticism. HSBC was a great place to work, but because of its scale and the need to try and provide continuity, it set out everything in really very well organized processes and controls. So everything was pretty well carved out. In this business, we challenge people to challenge everything we do, with the right intent, for our core goals, making customers happier, driving increased performance of the business, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, underpinning all of that, and this is all great, and when you think about the different stakeholders, performance excellence, we have to execute well, having great plans, having great people. If we don't execute well, it's all valueless, right? So certainly when you think about shareholders and things like that, and markets that have expectations on us as a public organization, you have to execute every single day, right? But all those other things, like I say, that typically comes when all the other things are right. the performance comes. And I think that's what we try and do. I guess the final thing I'd call out is, and it's linked to some of those trust things, is we've talked a lot more recently, and COVID, I think, probably was the instigator of this. It was inherent within other things that we did, but we didn't talk about it as much, and that is being kind. And that's about being kind to your customers. It's about being kind to each other, who are often having challenging situations, but it's also about being kind to yourself, right? And again, I think that has to be quite deliberate, because as we are increasingly busy as a community, if you don't stop long enough to think about being generous to yourself and being kind for all the things that you've been trying to do, and recognizing people for the things that they do. And say COVID was a great time to do it, because we were pushing people to operate in a different way, and we just needed to think more laterally about their well-being generally.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, isn't it? And we talk about business and how it evolves, and how that we're all driven. You're driven, I'm driven, people listening to this call will be driven. It is easy to be hard on yourself sometimes, isn't it? Or whether it's a focus piece that you then don't take time to step back and go, actually, it might not have worked, or we am doing a decent enough job, and what have you. So it probably mirrors a lot of the similar conversations that people are having around, actually, if you're kind to yourself and pretty decent human being, we're in a society place where it's accepted, and that's wholly a positive thing, isn't it? And going back to your culture piece, and I know you pretty well from kind of my time here at the club as such, but actually you look at the culture at Global Payments that you're portraying. Again, explain to people here about your own values. Do they perfectly mirror your own values? I know the answer to this, but I want you to explain it from that point of view. You as a person going around to that point, we're all busy all of the time. It's very hard to turn them on and off if the values are different to the culture of the individual be the business, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, and I just closing on the previous point, I would say, I think you can feel many of these things, right? It is a slightly intrinsic and intangible thing, but you can feel it. And similarly, I feel it, for example, at Tigers, and probably, I'm closer to, your team than the on-field team. I'm sure it's the same there. But, you can feel almost the family nature of the way in which people look after each other and things like that. And it's the same here. And indeed, we have a lot of family people here. We're a big local organisation, so naturally it happens. And that just feels good, because we're here a lot. We're here for a long time, right? We're probably here longer than we're at home, and therefore it needs to be a place that people feel good about being. So to your point, though, my personal values, and I spent a bit of time thinking about this in advance of today. Very similar, of course. It's a good match, and it's not because I've driven the corporate values, but if my values are fundamentally a compromise to the corporate values, then I'm probably in the wrong place, and I'm way too old to be putting myself in a place where that level of friction exists, because where that does exist, you get a lot of stress and tension, and that doesn't take you anywhere positive. I guess I'd maybe layer on, I think the way I think about those values, I think, building a network is really important to me. Relationships are really super important. And I think what I would say is, knowing a lot of people that know is better than knowing everything, right? Because you can't know everything. And it's that, but it's also, like I say, that intangible thing of, if you know a lot of people, if you've developed a good network of people that you can lean in on and are willing to help you because they know you will willingly help them, then that's just a really rewarding place to operate, and a much more high performance place to operate, because it's like I say, it's impossible for everybody to know everything, and I am more of a generalist, so I always tend to tell people I know very little, but I do know a lot of people that know a bit, right? Yeah. So that tends to help. I also think hard work beats talent. It's probably because I don't think necessarily I have talent. I have a lot of experience, and maybe that's the same thing. And I say, don't get me wrong, talent is important. And when you look at any superstars, I know you said we'll talk about sport as much as I know a lot about sport. All those guys have a lot of talent, but the talent amounts to nothing if they don't put a massive amount of work in. And I've got some great analogies of some of those things, but I think that's super important. And the thing I do, I think one of my legacies will be, I think I work really hard, right? Probably too hard. My wife will criticize me for the hours I put in, but it's what gives me a lot of comfort. But it's equally, like I say, I genuinely think you put that effort in, hard work will always beat talent. I think being inquisitive, I talked about before, is part of building that network. But I think the more inquisitive you are with people, the more you understand what's going on and therefore where you can add value. You understand what other people are grappling with and how you can help them. You understand, where people, might have sensitivities to things because you've got a better understanding of what's going on. So just kind of not in a forceful way, but being inquisitive about what's going on in people's worlds, I think again is a really positive attribute. And then to the point, and I do think it's difficult to say this about yourself, but it's certainly something I try to put really high on my list, which is that element of being kind. I'm probably not often kind enough on myself. Like I say, I typically, and we all, particularly when you've got families, right, you always put your families ahead of you, but trying to be kind to people, trying to help them with their problem. Sometimes that means that I end up accumulating a lot of other people's problems. But actually, I feel good about that. In the morning, if I look at myself, I feel good about, I'd rather be that person than the guy that's delivering all his milestones, but it's not helped anybody else. So I think that's the way I think personally about things anyway.
And is that part of your legacy as well? Because I wanted to talk to you about kind of that sort of thought processes. What will you leave behind at Global Payments, or the people that you meet along the way as such?
Yeah, I'm probably more interested in the latter than the former, and I don't mean that to be derogatory, but from a business point of view, the business will move on, right, very quickly. I've worked with some amazing people for years, and many of them have left. I mean, you knew Chris, right, who used to be my boss here. He was an amazing guy who I loved working with, but of course, certainly as he got into his mid-60s, he was not foolish enough to keep going. He retired, and I was like, I just don't know what it's going to be like without you. And you know what? A year on, it keeps rolling, right? It's a business. Ultimately, it has to roll on. Of course, not all businesses are like that. Some are very small, very individual-based businesses. But certainly, one of my legacies this business has to succeed me, right? It has to survive past me. I'm much more interested, to your point of, I guess, the culture and the people that I'll leave behind. And I don't know how long it'll be until I eventually retire, but I'm in my mid-50s. So, whether it's 5 or it's 10 years, it's not any longer than that. And therefore, I don't set myself big goals as such, but certainly I want to keep pushing on that value set, those cultures. And from a business point of view, try and help develop people, try and help. Probably the one thing I haven't talked about which is linked to a lot of this, is I see a lot of people struggling under pressure. And I think that's important. And it's not an easy one to really deal with, but one of my personal learnings has always been about, don't worry about things you can't control. It drives my kids crazy. My wife laughs at me every time I say it. But I often see, I see it at work, but I also see it at home. So I think it's one of these things that's evolving quite quickly certainly in this country and probably in many others. But as we drive for constant efficiency, it drives a lot more stress to people. And I see the analogy I use a lot with my son is, you're at a crossroads. You can turn left or you can right. You can't sit at the crossroads, right? So don't try and develop another path, because the other path, if you've done all the due diligence, is not there. There's lots of things you cannot control, and you really need to try and compartmentalize those and move on, right? Accept those things for what they are and move on. And I think I see, like I say, in a world that's very high pressure, and we try to reduce that as much as possible, I want to try and help people think through practically and in a more logical way that emotion of feeling out of control. And I don't know whether that's even possible, but I do want to continue to challenge that, because I do worry about the future of people's mental health around stress and the tension, because it feels like, as bad as it feels right now, lots of increasing mental health issues. I don't see anything that's really, apart from the fact that we're more open and talking about it, that pressure is continuing to build as we worry more about efficiency.
Yeah, and I'm going to move on to this point now, that efficiency is a really pertinent point, but it's short-termism as well is where I'm going with this as such. So you're sat there, 37 years, I think you said you started this. Your journey started 37 years ago, technically, or the thread of the same organization as such. You know, I read stats that the average CMO, so chief marketer, the average term of a CMO at the minute is about 18 months and what have you. And then there's a combination of the modern world and all those pieces there, but actually going back to how much of an achievement it is to be in an organization for 37 years. What do you put that down to? And I'll lead with this, that you talked about networks and the people, you know, the mentoring, because you've gone from a journey of being the talented junior, you know, really honed in your skills, to being the manager, to now being the director. You've gone through that full journey at the same company, you know. So talk us through that journey and you know, what you put that kind of longevity down to, because it you know, it won't happen again, because the modern world just probably won't allow it to some extent.
I think you're right. It probably won't happen again. Or like, it's interesting because, like I say, yesterday we celebrated our 15-year anniversary from joining Global Payments, and I know that's only a 15-year window, but we look back. I mean, we're an organisation in Leicester of 220 people, something like that. 90 of those people were here at the beginning, right? So I say it's 15 years, not 37 years. Will they still be here? And don't know. And of course, it is the sort of diminishing returns, of course. So, but I think I don't think it's impossible that it will happen from time to time, but it certainly won't be the standard expectation. And of course, I'll tell you, when I joined Midland Bank, you know, in 1985. Banking was considered a career for life, right? And so I joined probably thinking I was going to just grow through this organization. You know, for the longevity point, I think you have to balance two things, right? Of course, you have to balance what you want to achieve personally in your career with what the company wants, right? And in kind of both respects, I would say there's an element of luck in both of those things, but it's the evaluation people need to do. People shouldn't get frustrated with the job they're in, right? They need to look objectively at these things, and they should say, whatever their personal objectives. My personal ones were, I want to feel challenged every day, right? I want to learn something new. I want to feel like I'm adding value, right? They're the key ones.
That goes back to inquisitiveness, doesn't it?
It does, and I think the interesting thing is I look back at least one, probably only one of my jobs actually that I did, and I think I stayed there too long. And the reason for that is it was delivering to all those metrics, but it was a job that would do that forever, right? The same job I would come, you know, because when you're working with customers, every customer is different. Of course, I'm being challenged differently every day. And that was, as I was evaluating myself, because I was evaluating myself, even at a fairly early stage, it was still ticking those boxes. The way I've managed my own career is I've looked at these, I mean, this is really slightly geeky, but it's, again, perhaps the way my brain works. I've thought of these things almost like as sort of a column graph, right? And, you know, with different skills in it, right? Verbal communication, written communication, decision-making, team building, team lead, you know, whatever, right? And what I've actually done is I've kind of gone into jobs really with an idea of how it's going to complement one of those columns, right? I want to improve my decision-making. I'm going to go and run risk for a while. There's nothing like running risk to make decisions. Okay, brilliant. Okay, I want to improve my commercial awareness. Okay, I'm going to go run a sales team. Never run a sales team before, right? Could I do it? Do that and that. And again, it's interesting because as you go into some of these things, you've always got to back yourself. You've got to be clear on what you're doing. But equally, take that last example. I had confidence in my ability to go and run a sales team because I believe through great relationships with customers, you know, developing a good sort of communication skills, etc. You can get what you want. And I'll use you as an example, Mark. You and your team do not sell to me. I mean, inadvertently you do, right? But but you're not selling things to me. You're actually, through the relationship, through understanding what we want to do, through trying to think about how you can help me do that. It's not a sales job now. And actually, if we miss, and I think you've always been really clear on this, if we can't help each other, then it's the right to kind of enjoy a beer together and not do business together. But it's not been like that. And this is similar. On the other side of the equation, of course, you've got customers, you've got the business, and the business needs to obviously understand where it's going to extract value from you. And in that respect, I've probably been quite lucky. I've not been a specialist at anything. I've said this a couple of times this morning, but I've not been a specialist at anything. I'm a general at quite a lot, and actually I've probably got a reputation of getting stuff done, right? And that's worked pretty well for me. But that everybody should look quite objectively at that quid pro quo, right? You have to be able to deliver something to the business, whatever their business is trying to do. And that's not always about, hard work is a massively important bit, but it has to be an alignment of your skill at the right time, delivering to particular goals that the company's got, being able to make a difference. Some of those things, when you operate in a general environment, chance of meeting some of those things is probably easier than going, I don't know, I'm a compliance expert, which today is really important, tomorrow might be less important. I'm making that example up. But I think if you look at yourself and say, my own personal goals are these things. I want to be a specialist. I want to be a generalist. How do I look at how these things develop me, and what are my core objectives through my career? That's the most important thing for an individual. And then just being really open to the quid pro quo, saying, hopefully that matches what the company's trying to do, and I can see how I can add value. And if at the time that isn't true, probably time to look for somewhere else where it actually is a good fit. And that's the way I think about it anyway. So I never know, it could be tomorrow, it won't be, but it could be tomorrow that, my particular, what I've got to give isn't a good fit for this organization. But that would be fair, right? It's given me a great employment, whether that's for 5 years, for 10 years, for 37 years. If the quid pro quo is no longer a good synergy, it's time to part company in good faith.
Yeah, and always, choose another sport analogy. You look at football, for example. That is a Luton Town as we speak today. That is a Newcastle United, in that you need certain skills or behaviours to get to a point, but then the next point you might need a different set of skills and behaviour. And then it becomes down to, have you got it, expertise, or the willingness to learn? And right at the start, we talk about change and how it's uncomfortable. Actually, by embracing it with the right mindset, or having the culture that can embrace that sort of change, will mean you keep people longer, take them further, and ultimately the business benefits off the back end, while sprinkling the people who are box ready for that situation at that moment in time, doesn't it? Fascinating. We will talk sport. I will let you go on that. Global Payments, one of the longest partners we have here at Tigers, and certainly it's a relationship that's evolved, whether that is back of the shorts and kind of you went from the shirt down to from a brand, but actually as the relationship evolves as such. But ultimately, I'd like to think you're very kind in how you talk about the team here, but actually the core of that is actually meeting the business objectives when we started to where we kind of are today as such. But with that in mind, what's the single most important thing you consider when selecting a partnership, whether at the start today or that moment in time? Forget we knew each other, but we were going into your office and pitching as such to you.
Yeah, I remember. I can't remember the exact time frame, but I remember it very vividly, because I'll say as a backdrop, it helped. Actually, it helped and it hindered, and I've been a lifetime fan of Tigers, right? And what I mean by that is there's always a bit of a head and heart collaboration in some of those things, and I'm not in the business of jumping into a partnership just because I love the team, right? That's a bonus, if you like, and it's a very good bonus. But I think I said it, and I mean it, is for the first while that we were working with Tigers, or talking to Tigers, I should say, we spent a lot of time not us talking, actually, you asking about what we were trying to achieve, what was important. We knew enough about the club already, and I think when we were looking, we were looking to partner with somebody. We partnered with Leicester County Cricket before, but that was a kind of a fairly, I shouldn't say this to be critical, it's not, but it was a very passive relationship, right? Which which in some respects maybe ticked our goal of brand awareness, which at the time that we morphed into global payments was very important to us. But it was in its nature a bit like a marriage. That's a bit of a veneer, right? Tiger spent a long time in talking to us about what we were trying to do and how we thought and how you thought you might be able to contribute to some of those goals. I've really not come across anybody I'm trying to think, in this type of partnership. We have other partnerships that are more commercial around, technology partners and payments and how they live together. That's a very different relationship where the trade-off is quite clear. In this sort of a relationship, I've never come across anybody who has been as proactive at trying to help us. And I think, similarly, we have good grown-up conversations around where those things can't work in, the way we'd all love them to work. But I think, in honesty, a lot of it was the people. And I remember going to the first partner dinner, and it was the guys at Mattioli Woods. I don't think it was Ian. I can't remember who it was now, but I remember sitting down with them and saying, "How did you make the business case for this work?" I said, "Because obviously I really want to do this because I love the Tigers, and it kind of plays to my gut instinct of it would be a good thing to do. But if I'm going to write a business case for spending money now, I need to try and explain." He said, "If you're going to write a business case about it, it's going to be really challenging, Pete. You really have to take a bit of a leap of faith in the people that you're working with. And, do you believe they can help you do those things?" And that was great advice. And I think it's one of the challenges for you. I know you know it, right? Because lots of people are trying to square away the business case, and the business case does come together ultimately. But you do have to take a leap of faith of, I believe this can happen. It can add real value. And every single year, I would say incremental value comes from new areas, and I can't call them all out, but I do think it's a lot about your interest in our company, your investment in our company, your interest in what we're trying to achieve, and your pursuit of trying to add incremental value back to us.
I think that's very kind, and I can probably add another layer to that, and from our point of view, and how it works. And that you're right. Fundamentally, it's people. It's completely down to the people, because whether I'm selling a £10 product or sponsorship or a partnership as such, really, at some point, Pete, or your marketing team or your commercial team, you've got to trust me and my team with your money, but with that money to deliver what we've said. So it goes full circle. And going back to that business case, is what is the ROI on an advertising board? What's your ROI on hospitality? And that is that. And actually, this becomes about us and the culture, is that, we genuinely believe we work for you. So that's where the evolution comes from, in that if we see something that might not be perfect for another brand, but would work for Global Payments, it's a conversation. And that's not a let's renew, let's do all that. But actually, this might work for you because I know what you need this partnership to deliver for you, again, personally as the CEO, but also your marketing team. But actually the components within it, yes, you agree the components, and to some extent it sits in the drawer because you have the relationship to do it, and you keep going back to it. But it comes down to, again, people. You mentioned trust, and it's pretty simple when you break it down to that extent. But it's, that this is built on 7-8 years of knowledge and friendship to some extent, isn't it, really? But
I think
as old as time, those, the relationship, the networking building, brought to life here in 2023 to some extent.
I think the other thing, I'll call out, I guess, two things. One kind of related is, that I think Tigers has made the off-field business super professional in a way that I don't see others doing, right? And that's before and iterated and improved since you've arrived, Mark, right? Andrea before, look, it's a team I've loved working with, but it was a super professional group of people, where others, like I say, some of the sponsorship thing is just a byproduct of needing to try and raise money to do the things that they need to do really on field, right? And the way that you structure that, and even the way you talk about on field and off field, I think is absolutely right and important. The other thing, which I forgot and I should have talked about, because it's my soapbox, is the community that Tigers have tried to build through its partners. And again, the way in which you try and bring lots of partners together, whether it's things like the business forums or whether it's I've developed a lot of people who I genuinely enjoy spending time with in different partners that are in there. But it's not just because we all are quite like to watch the rugby. It's because it's nice to spend time. It's nice to talk about things that's going on inside our businesses. It's nice to look for ways in which we can help each other. Because, like I say, lots of great businesses are partnering with Tigers and with lots of common needs. But I think that community, and I do think there's lots of ways in which that can continue to grow and improve. But again, I think you do a great job of trying to bring those people together, and I think that's a very valuable asset for the club, especially when you're looking for new partners as well as keeping your existing partners. Is being able to plug people into that community, I think, is amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Amazing. We're nearing the end. I've got 2 questions left to ask you, and one of them to kind of put we talk about sport, and you've talked about your partnerships and more maybe commercial, but those that are outside of sport. In terms of sport as a product in relation to your business, what can it bring to your partnerships that maybe some of the others can't? Is it the emotion? Is it the experience? What do you define it as?
Blimey. I think it crops up in a number of different ways. From a people point of view, we use things like this as a good example of how effective teams work together in challenging circumstances when things are going right. There's lots of great analogies around sporting teams and high-performing working teams. So that works pretty well, and we'll gladly point at Tigers and say that's part of the reason why we do this because we like to draw the correlation. The trying to give other people access to things that they enjoy doing, like coming and watching games with you and things like that, is equally very important. And kind of in a slightly more there's probably a number of others that aren't coming straight to head, but the other thing is, in our particular industry, we're very fascinated with the whole stadia market, and we do a lot of work in that market. It's a very complex place for payments to take place, and we like working with you guys because you can give us sort of good feedback, you can give us good insights as to what's going on inside there. So as a vertical in it, it's saying we work hard at trying to not provide homogenous solutions to every, because it's different in different environments. So again, that's another critically important one. But I guess the final one I should say, in all of it is kind of it's that piece of competing and teamwork. Going back to my initial point, I think those analogies, those correlations between on pitch versus sort of in industry, I think are really quite fascinating.
Yeah, no, fair. And then your last question before I let you go. We've talked about business, we talked about you, Pete, we talked about sport, and we talked about, again, Harper, 37 years is an unbelievable time to develop a career.
I'm aging.
I'm not much older than that, Pete. Let me throw that one at you. But in terms of learnings and choose us a book. If you were to recommend one book that's kind of changed your life, professionally or personally, but it's a pretty open-ended question. What's your Bible? What's your mantra?
Well, you've heard me talk some of the principles. There's a few actually. There's I can't remember the author now, but the chimp paradox is quite an interesting one. I think that's quite interesting. But the one I think I would encourage most people to read is a book called Bounce by Matthew Said. I don't know if you've read that.
I've
But
got
he,
kids, so yeah, I think we've all read that book. We've got kids, haven't
yeah. So for those who haven't, what he does is he explores fundamentally why the street that he was a sort of a very high performing table tennis player, but he explores why this street that he grew up on has produced more top table tennis players than the rest of the country put together. And it's kind of complicated, but not complicated. The main thing is it goes back to what I said before, which is, practice and hard work is more important than natural talent. And the answer to some of the, well, actually, I shouldn't say, because if those people haven't read it, it'll kind of give it away. But it really plays to that. There's a number of environmental things. It isn't about the fact that Matty was born, with hands like a table tennis bat, right? It was that he wasn't, having some sort of physical, natural characteristic that made him expert at it. It was all the environmental things around him that actually meant that, indeed, the fact that there was lots of really high-performing table tennis players that brought them all forward. And I think that's really important. And there's lots of interesting correlations there. He's a super interesting guy. I met him once and had a good conversation with him. He's quite interesting. And the only unfortunate thing is he also used to do a podcast with Robbie Savage, which is probably turned me off a bit. But yeah, that's a really interesting book.
Yeah.
And I say the point that I do come back to a lot is, we do through interviews when we're recruiting people, spend a lot of time looking for that raw talent. That experience is really much more important. That general characteristic of somebody who you will be able to put the work in, is really motivated to work really hard, is going to practice more than anybody else to get to where they need to be. Much more important than, and I'm bound to say that, right? Like I said, I left school at 16. Academically, I probably didn't have a lot to show in my CV that would have made me a natural character for doing any of these things. Certainly 37 years on, none of that really matters a bean, right? The fact that, I will give everything I've got to give to deliver what we need to deliver, that is where people get interested.
Yeah, no, really good. And a really good book. You hit the nail on the head then. I think that, I do have children, so we joke about how we're going to make our money out of them, and that was the reason behind it. But it's a really good, cool explanation of talent to some extent, isn't it, really? And with that, again, Pete, thank you for your time. Very busy guy, truly fascinating, and here's to another 37 years here. So as long as you're evolving and inquisitive, I'd back you.
37 years, but not 37 years working.
Cheers, Pete. Thank you.
Cheers, Mark. Thanks.